So now we can consider how sexism, a form of prejudice that reflects and perpetuates gender inequality, may be related to health through pathways other than the material mechanisms by which, for example, sexism leads to inequity in pay and so forth. So we're looking for the more psychosocial pathways by which sexism, exposure to sexism, might lead to bad health. Sexist ideologies can be defined as a system of rewards and punishments that provide incentive for women to remain in conventional gender roles. And it's argued that sexism as an ideology and the practices of sexism both sustain and importantly legitimize gender inequality. And that's a really important aspect of this. The ways in which sexism is effective in reproducing gender inequality, but also that with that kind of hegemonic power, social control dimension, legitimating gender inequality at the same time. How it affects health is unclear. And what we'll discuss next is maybe the fact that it depends on the type of sexism to which one is exposed. Glick and Fisk have developed this conceptual model of sexism referred to as ambivalent sexism. And what they are describing is what they refer to as two sides of the same coin. One is a hostile dimension of sexism, and the other is contrasting as more or less benevolent. And their model of sexism, one of the key aspects of it is it challenges a very simplistic equation of sexism with antipathy toward women. And to elaborate on that, I'm going to read directly from an article of theirs from 2001. The equation of prejudice with antipathy is challenged by recent research on sexism. Benevolent sexism, a subjectively favorable, chivalrous ideology that offers protection and affection to women who embrace conventional roles, coexists with hostile sexism, antipathy toward women who are viewed as usurping men's power. And for those of you familiar with sort of traditional feminist constructions of sexism, this is analogous to the pedestal gutter construction of how women's notions, what notions of women's place and position in society exist and coexist. Okay, resuming from their article, hostile and benevolent sexism are complementary, cross-culturally prevalent ideologies, both of which predict gender inequality. Women, as compared with men, consistently reject hostile sexism, but often endorse benevolent sexism, especially in the most sexist cultures. By rewarding women for conforming to a patriarchal status quo, benevolent sexism inhibits gender equality. More generally, affect towards minority groups is often ambivalent, but subjectively positive stereotypes are not necessarily benign. Although benevolent sexism may sound oxymoronic, this term recognizes that some forms of sexism are, for the perpetrator, subjectively benevolent, characterizing women as pure creatures who ought to be protected, supported, and adored, and whose love is necessary to make a man complete. This idealization of women simultaneously implies that they are weak and best suited for conventional gender roles. Being put on a pedestal is confining, yet the man who places a woman there is likely to interpret this as cherishing rather than restricting her, and many women may agree. Despite the greater social acceptability of benevolent sexism, research suggests that it is a crucial component to hostile sexism that helps to pacify women's resistance to societal gender inequality. So let's look a little bit at what these two dimensions of sexism are about. Here are examples of items from the hostile sexism subscale of the ambivalent sexism inventory. It measures the extent to which individuals endorse statements like women are too easily offended, most women do not fully appreciate all that men do for them, women exaggerate problems, get a kick out of teasing men by seeming sexually available and then refusing male advances. So this would be the more overt, very obviously sexist and somewhat and very offensive kinds of notions that one would recognize as sexist pretty unequivocally. We have, of course, reason to believe that hostile sexism of this kind is still alive and well. Here are some really illuminating quotes from various political figures over the past several years. Some of these are most of these are very depressingly recent, and I'll let you pause there and enjoy those if you like. The benevolence subscale looks like this. Many women have a quality of purity that few men possess. Men are incomplete without women. Men compared to men tend to have a superior moral sensibility. Men compared to men tend to have a more refined sense of taste and culture and so forth. So the more pedestal, worshipping, cherishing kinds of notions of sexism. And the problem with benevolent sexism, like the microaggressions and types of modern racism we spoke about last time, is that it's very insidious. It's harder to see. It's easier to normalize and accommodate. And in effect, it's system justifying. And here this gets into the ways in which benevolent sexism works to support hegemonic, normative kinds of cultural concepts and belief systems that support the status quo. So, as I'll illustrate in a minute, this has been looked at specifically with respect to sexism and how system justifying beliefs in effect generate ideological and behavioral support for, in this case, the patriarchal status quo. The risks to health and well-being of not accommodating this form of gender inequality are unclear, but there is evidence that from the literature that there are real risks to women's well-being and health that may be a result of rejection of the status quo in terms of depression, in terms of violence, and so forth. But we have to recognize that this internalization and accommodation of gender norms, of gender inequality, of the patriarchal status quo is an intrinsic and hegemonic dimension of inequality. And it's effective because for efficient subordination, what's wanted is that the structure not appear to be a cultural artifact kept in place by human decision or custom, but that it appear natural, again, that it's normalized, it's the natural order of thing. It appears to be a quite direct consequence of facts about the beast which are beyond the scope of human manipulation. And getting back to this concept of system justification, which is really the flip side of hegemonic social power, referring to the generalized ideologic motive to justify the existing social order, often resulting in internalization of inferiority by members of disadvantaged groups. So what system justification, this theory developed by Jost and colleagues and empirically demonstrated repeatedly in the literature, does for us is it gives us a way of understanding the flip side of hegemonic ideological social control or social influence, because it's not hard to understand why those in positions of power, relative high status, elites and so forth want to use hegemonic discourse, ideology and whatnot in order to maintain the status quo, but it's not intuitively obvious why those who are not benefiting from that status quo would do the same. And their research really gives a really rich theory as to why that's the case, and then demonstrates how it plays out in a lot of different instances with respect to different dimensions of the status quo. And here is an example from Jost and Kay in 2005, looking at how priming, this is an experimental study, priming with the kinds of cues that would be said to reflect benevolent sexism is associated with women's endorsement or women's engaging in gender-specific system justification. So what does that mean? You have two experimental arms shown here, one no exposure, this is the control arm, and here's the exposed arm. The exposed arm is primed with the presentation of what are referred to as 5 communal traits, which is a form of benevolent sexism. They're asked to describe the extent to which they think the 5 following traits apply more to women or to men, and to what degree. And those 5 traits are considerate, honest, happy, warm, and moral. And so again, you can see how these reflect that kind of the notion of women's moral superiority and so forth that is consistent with the benevolent sexism. So what they're asked to just simply endorse their beliefs along those lines. The extent to which they endorse those beliefs is irrelevant. They're just being primed with a cue to think about and have in mind these kind of benevolent sexism traits. And then they're asked to endorse items that reflect system justification that were developed by Kay and Jost and have been reworded to focus on gender inequality. These are the following. Some are reverse scored. In general, relations between men and women are fair. B. The division of labor in families generally operates as it should. C. Gender roles need to be radically restructured. That one's scored the other way. D, for women, the United States is the best country in the world to live in. E, most policies relating to gender and the sexual division of labor serve the greater good. F, everyone, male or female, has a fair shot at wealth and happiness. G, sexism in society is getting worse every year, also reverse scored. And H, society is set up so that men and women usually get what they deserve. So all of these items you can see reflect, to the extent they're endorsed, the idea that everything is as it should be. The status quo is okay, it's fair, and yes, there are differences in attainment. It doesn't deny that there may be differences in outcomes between men and women, but basically everybody has a fair shot at getting there, and the system is as it should be. So what this experiment shows is that for those who are not exposed to the priming of communal stereotypes or benevolent sexism, men are much more likely to endorse or engage in gender-specific system justification than women. But when they are exposed to these communal stereotypes, there's a non-significant impact on men's endorsement of the gender status quo, but women suddenly are much more likely to be endorsing of the system of engaging in gender system justification, and also much more likely to do so to the extent that's comparable to men. Okay, so now we have several reasons why we might think we might be able to explain this paradox. We talked about biological reasons. We talked about the material pathway, that cohabitation and shared interests, which might result in resource pooling, would be very relevant for understanding why gender inequality doesn't necessarily translate into health inequalities through material pathways. And now we have a third explanation, which has more to do with the psychosocial consequences of sexism, reflecting the extent to which these dimensions of sexism are perceived as being sort of natural, and that there are reasons to believe that through the normalization of these notions around gender and the gender order, we have a degree of complicity, system justification operating, especially to the extent that what we're working with here are the more benevolent forms of sexism rather than the overt hostile dimensions of that. And that brings us to the end of this segment.